for a closer look at the refugee situation, let's bring in Gerald Knaus from Berlin. He's the chairman of the European Stability Initiative. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on this program. What we heard there from our reporter in Warsaw, that it's really been a noble response from Europe, Poland in particular, to host millions of people fleeing Ukraine. Do you believe that countries in Europe are doing enough to help refugees?
Well, as you pointed out yourself, this is historic. There has not been such a refugee movement since the 1940s in Europe. It took 5 years for there to be more than 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Now it's been 3 weeks to reach more than 3 million refugees leaving Ukraine, and there is no end in sight. So it is true that civil society in Poland, in Slovakia, in Moldova, in Romania has mobilized impressively. It is true that the European Union has made a historic decision by saying that all Ukrainians not only can enter legally the European Union, but also have the right to stay. They do not need to apply for asylum. But it is also true that this challenge is much bigger than anything these governments have ever dealt with. And in this respect, the response is not yet sufficient. There needs to be a strong effort to help distribute refugees across Europe to other countries that can provide a school and a roof over the head, because we must expect that more millions will flee Ukraine.
Yeah, that leads quite nicely to my next question, because Poland, of course, taking in a lot of refugees, and countries neighboring Ukraine, of course, because they are so close. But is the burden actually being shared fairly enough among countries across both Europe and North America?
Well, the political decision that the European interior ministers took to allow Ukrainians the same rights, the right to access to healthcare, of course, a residence permit, a work permit, everywhere in the European Union, this is historic. And this makes it possible, for example, to organize an airlift. So if Finland, which has offered yesterday to take more refugees, is ready, one can just organize transports to Finland, to Sweden, to Portugal, to Ireland. The challenge is organizing this, and the challenge, of course, is communicating with the refugees, because many of them, understandably, initially want to stay close to their home country, because don't forget, it is the women and the children that are largely coming. The men are not allowed to leave. So the fathers, brothers, husbands of these refugees stay behind to fight in Ukraine. And that means at first, initially, many wanted to stay close. But as is becoming clear, there will be no quick return to Ukraine. There will be more displacement. And if all these women and children are supposed to be accommodated humanely, there will need to be an organized distribution. And this has to be done quickly. Otherwise, people will end up in the streets.
Yeah, definitely an organized distribution, as you say, and a mobilization of countries across Europe. But Gerald, I'd like to know from you, do you think there's been a very big difference about the way that Europe has embraced people coming from Ukraine compared to when we say that we saw scores of Syrians making their way to Europe to try and also escape a war in their country? You mentioned earlier that it took 5 years for 3 million Syrians to be here in Turkey, but we saw millions of Syrians also try to get to Europe, and it seems that they weren't quite treated the same way as we're seeing Ukrainians being treated.
Well, there are two issues here. I mean, the first and the crucial difference is that Ukrainians had visa-free travel to Europe since 2017. And that meant that as the war erupted, every Ukrainian could legally enter the European Union. Now, that meant that the decision the European interior ministers had to take was, if they do not want to close the border, and fortunately, not a single government proposed this, well, then it was clear that millions would come. And in this respect, it was, yes, historic, yes, generous, but it was also without an alternative to say that all these Ukrainians would be welcomed. For the Syrians, of course, the situation was different. 1 million refugees came from Turkey to the European Union in 12 months, in 2015 to 2016, mostly Syrians. They were welcomed in some countries, Sweden, Germany, Austria, there was a similar mobilization in society, but other European countries who felt too far away from the conflict, who were suspicious, who don't have much contact with people from the Middle East, they did not react in the same way. And this was a problem. And there is a second problem, which is acute even today, which is, of course, the brutality at Europe's external borders, the pushbacks we have seen in the Mediterranean, including in the Aegean. But what the Ukrainian crisis shows us is that there is empathy if only people understand and hear the stories and identify with the victims of this aggression. Just like Turks had empathy for millions of Syrians when they had no other place to flee and let them in.
Gerald Knaus, I really appreciate you putting this all into context for us, live to us there from Berlin. Thank you so much.
I thank you.